Coming up on the Together for Good podcast, why doesn't prayer work? There's some great theologians from throughout history that have some really cool points about this. I can't wait to share this with you. Here we go. Welcome to the Together for Good podcast, a podcast created by Bethany Lutheran Church in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, and hosted by me, Pastor Nate Preisinger. On Together for Good, our goal is to provide practical, engaging content that supports you without expectations. Whether you're feeling disconnected from traditional religion or simply exploring what faith means in your life, we're here to walk alongside you. No matter where you are on your journey of faith, we're glad you're here. Welcome to Together for Good. So what's the deal with prayer? This is a question that as a pastor, I actually get a lot, and people want to know how they're supposed to be praying, and usually, more to the point, they want to know how they can pray in such a way that they'll get what they want. Most of the time when we come with prayer, it is with really good intentions. I don't think there's many people who try to use prayer as just another quick life hack to get them exactly the job, the body, the finances that they've always dreamed of. I think we realize that there's something deeper and more intentional about prayer. But what we do often want is we want our prayers to be able to enact change in the world in the way that we see fit. And so we will pray for specific outcomes within the political sphere or within the national global sphere. Or we'll pray for specific outcomes as it relates to deeply troubling moments. We'll pray for healing for a friend or a family. That's probably one of the most common ways that prayer gets utilized. And this in turn creates the issue because people will be praying so fervently, so faithfully, not for themselves, but for someone else who is suffering. And sometimes, unfortunately, they will not see or find the result they were hoping for on the other side. This is deeply troubling and can really shake someone's faith when you pray so hard for healing and it doesn't come or it doesn't resolve anywhere near the way that you were expecting or hoping for. And it leads you into these moments of despair, wondering, God, where are you? Why wouldn't you want this, God? Why would you allow for this terrible tragedy to take place? Why would you ignore my prayers for this tragedy to be averted, and yet it happens anyway? You can start to see why this becomes such a difficult, trying moment for so many people. And I'm sure many people have stories of how they lost their faith because prayers went unanswered. But I believe that all of this is operating under incorrect assumptions about what prayer is actually about and for. There is a great Lutheran, shout out Lutherans, theologian, Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was in Germany in the 1800s, I believe it is, 1800s. And Schleiermacher wrote about this phenomenon specifically. And he talks about prayer as an act of absolute dependence. But in his explanation of it, one of the things he points out is just the logical fallacy that we enter into if we believe that prayer is our mechanism for changing God's mind. Because what Schleiermacher says is, if God is an infinite divine being, the most supreme being in all the universe, beyond our comprehension, then that being also, by definition, must be beyond our control. And so if God can be swayed by the prayers of individual human beings who are so much lesser than God, well, if that's the case, then that's not really much of a God at all. That's not a supreme, divine, all-powerful being. That's a being that can be manipulated by the prayers of, these little thoughts in someone's head of a human being. I'm putting it all pretty flippantly, but that's ultimately Schleiermacher's point. It's like this can't be what prayer is all about because it makes no sense. God, he didn't use these terms because it was a long time ago, before the advent of vending machines, but God is not a vending machine. It's not, punch in C5 and get a Twix bar. God has to be something so much more beyond than a simple transactional type of relationship. It's like, okay, Nate, like, great. That sounds wonderful. You just kind of ruined prayer for everyone. Then what is the point of praying at all? Great question. Please stick with me. The point of prayer is connection with God and being in God's presence. Paul Tillich, another Lutheran theologian, he was writing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s primarily. And what he writes about is that God, he says, is the ground of being, and speaks about God in this way. And you can hear echoes of Schleiermacher there, right? Absolute dependence, ground of being. You're getting the idea. What Paul Tillich says is that God is not some sort of being, but God is the existence itself, being itself, the ground of being itself. What I really appreciate about that, as confusing as it is and as hard as it is to wrap our minds around, but there's something about that definition that immediately starts with us recognizing that we cannot comprehend or understand God. God is the absolute soup of existence itself. That's what Paul Tillich would say, or to that effect. And so if that's the case, then there's no real way for us to sway the opinions of this God as if God is another person. Like, hey, by the way, I'd like to put in a formal request for this event to take place. Like, well, that's not really how it works, because God is all events at all times and in all places. When we start to understand and come to God with this sense of humility, just the bigness, the vastness, the incomprehensibility of God, then in turn, the way that you pray is going to be very different. And so what Paul Tillich would say is that prayer connects us to what is ultimate. Prayer is a way of connecting with this ground of being. It's a way of rooting ourself in something bigger than ourselves. And with that, it's more about trust, which leads me to Martin Luther, another good Lutheran theologian. He was in the 1500s, and he talks about how prayer shapes us into dependent trust. We believe that there is some sort of force, goodness, that God is love, and that God is everywhere at all times and in all places. So hard to fully wrap our minds around, but that's the point, that somehow there's something bigger going on than our struggles with the current moment. As it relates to prayer, one thing to remember is that Jesus himself prayed and had his prayer go unanswered. Or in fact, Jesus prayed and the opposite took place. On the night of his betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane, we're told in the Gospels that Jesus prays for this cup to pass from him. And that obviously is not what happened. And I love that our scriptures include this story, that Jesus, the one who was really good, who followed all of the law, who did everything exactly right, he prays and doesn't get what he wants. And so we don't need to start thinking that our prayers went unanswered because God thought we were bad or that we weren't good enough, because even Jesus wasn't able to get the prayer answered in the way that he wanted. But more so than that, it also just reveals to us that prayer has to be about something different than changing God's mind. Jesus was praying for this, but what was actually going on in his heart at that moment? What was he hoping to accomplish on this incredibly tumultuous moment in his earthly life? I think what prayer is about is bringing our concerns to God, bringing our longings to God, and simply trusting, not expecting necessarily for everything to change, but recognizing that there is something so healing and helpful about expressing what sits in our hearts so deeply and sharing that with this divine, eternal presence that is God, this ground of being. You see, prayer is the space oftentimes where your ache and God's presence meet. There's so much in this world that troubles our hearts and that scares us and that makes us anxious. And prayer can be that practice that allows us in some small way to let go and to turn it over and to discover some sense of hope. Maybe hope, yes, that things will actually change right now in the present moment, but also maybe grounding us in a hope that's so much bigger than the present moment. You see, so much of the story of Jesus and the scriptures and the gospels, I think the message of the Christian faith is that God encounters us in moments of suffering and difficulty, that's where God's power is revealed most fully. Theologians call this the theology of the cross, this idea that God's power is most fully revealed in Jesus's suffering and death. And we extrapolate out from that. Okay, if that's the case, then yes, like when I am suffering or struggling, to be able to have a way to connect with the presence of God that is with me when things seem really, really bad. That's what prayer is about and what it provides us with. Obviously, there's other times that you might want to pray, prayers of thanksgiving, prayers of just presence and listening. That's a really big, important practice. But notice how all of these are just allowing you to take moments in the history of your life and to link them with the ground of being, to connect you with that which is ultimate, as Paul Tillich would say, to root you in a sense of absolute dependence, as Schleiermacher would say, to create in you dependent trust, as Martin Luther would say. See, all these great theologians have been trying to point us towards this reality for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet, I think what we really want is the vending machine God. We want it to be easy to just press the buttons and get exactly what we want. And yet, if that was the case, if God had to answer every prayer exactly as it was articulated, the world would be chaos. Because there's many people out there who are praying for very different things. There are many people praying for one very particular thing to take place, and other folks praying very fervently for the exact opposite to take place. And so maybe it's more about how can we allow this practice to root us in a sense of hope that is eternal and so much bigger than the present moment and our current feelings or opinions, because those are always subject to change as well. What you pray for today, you might be praying for the exact opposite in 5 years. Where would we be then? The point of prayer, I think, especially at moments of deep sorrow and difficulty, is for us to recognize that God is with us when nothing changes. On the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that moment has captured the imagination of theologians and pastors and philosophers for thousands of years, because it's such a revelatory detail about how God relates to us. Jesus is God incarnate, and through that cry of dereliction, Jesus is stating that he knows what it's like to feel abandoned by God. And yet Jesus is God, right? Like, this is circular logic. It doesn't make sense. It's so hard to wrap our minds around. But what it points us to is to recognize that God is with us even when we feel those moments of being completely abandoned by God, those moments of complete despair, when all we're left with is doubt and lament. Somehow God is present in moments like that too. And in fact, God has experienced that in God's very being through the cry of Jesus. It's a lot to think about. It's hard to fully wrap our minds around, but I hope it can be of value to you, because I know I get this question all the time. Why didn't God answer my prayers? And I don't have a great answer for you on saying, like, I'm not sure why God didn't give you exactly what you wanted. It seems so logical, yes, that this would be what God would hope for and what God would will. And yet I think what we need to start to wrap our minds around is this idea that prayer isn't about changing God's mind. It's about bringing us and allowing us to be shaped by dependence and trust in God, and dependence and trust in a bigger promise. Because that's also part of all of these pieces that I'm saying here, is that prayer connects us with this ground of being, with something infinite and vast and eternal and beyond our imagination. And it helps us hopefully recognize in some small way that the promises of God, that the answers from God to us are bigger than the present moment as well. And so maybe the prayer isn't answered exactly the way we wanted in this moment, in this point in history. And yet, can we trust that God's promises are bigger than just this isolated moment? That maybe the answer we were hoping and praying and longing for is yet to be revealed. This ties us to an eternal understanding, an everlasting understanding of the ways that God works. And maybe in some small way, the practice of prayer is what helps root us in those types of eternal promises. So there you go. A lot of thoughts on prayer. 3 dead German guys who all happen to be Lutheran. Paul Tillich, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Martin Luther, and those are the 3 we covered. If you want to Google them and learn more, send this to someone who maybe has asked you about prayer, why you pray, how it works, or someone who's struggling or having a difficult time. And this week I challenge you to see prayer as a way of rooting yourself in eternal promises of God, and see it as that act of trust, that source of connection to the ground of being that is our God. As always, thanks for listening, everyone. Stay in peace. Thank you for listening to the Together for Good podcast. If you'd like more resources for your walk of faith, please visit our website, bethany-denver.org, or download our mobile app by searching Bethany Connect in your phone's app store.